The canyon breathed cold air even in summer. That was the first thing you noticed, stepping into that narrow passage between the sandstone walls and feeling the temperature drop, like walking from a lit room into a cellar. The walls rose 40 feet on either side, and where they narrowed closest at the top, they left a slot of sky no wider than a man's outstretched arms, and through that slot, clouds moved with a speed that seemed too fast for the stillness below. The ground inside was fine red sand, packed hard by intermittent water and the passage of things heavier than wind, and in the early morning, before the sun climbed high enough to angle down through the slot overhead, that sand held the cold close to it, the way old stone holds cold. Not as an absence of warmth, but as a presence of something else entirely, something patient and indifferent, and very much its own. Moss grew on the north-facing wall in patches the color of old copper. A trickle of water had cut a groove along the base of the eastern face, and in certain seasons it ran clear enough to drink from if you were careful where you put your palm. Birds nested in the upper ledges, swifts mostly, invisible until they moved, and then suddenly, everywhere at once, threading the air above the slot with the kind of precision that looked like organized chaos until you watched long enough to realize there was nothing chaotic about it. The canyon had a name on no map that Reese Calver had ever seen. The men who used it, drovers mostly and occasionally the mail rider from the eastern relay station, called it the Cut, and left it at that, because it didn't need more name than that. It was a feature of the land, not a place anyone stayed. Reese had ridden through the Cut, perhaps a dozen times over the years. He knew where the trickle deepened enough to water a horse, and where the walls pinched so close that a loaded pack animal had to be turned sideways and walked through carefully, and where the exit opened onto the flat scrubland to the north like a door swung suddenly wide. He knew these things the way a person knows the details of a road they have traveled without particular intention, not because they set out to learn it, but because the land teaches you whether you ask to be taught or not. What he had not done in any of those dozen crossings was make the journey with someone who needed to stop every quarter mile to breathe. Saguaro. That was the name the old man went by among the people Reese had dealt with over the years, though whether it was a given name or a title or simply what someone had decided to call him at some point and it had stuck, Reese couldn't say with certainty. He was old. That much was beyond question. Old in the way that certain things in the landscape were old. The stacked caprock on the high mesas, the dry riverbeds that had forgotten the water that made them. His face held a record of weather and years that no simple count could measure, and when he walked with a care that was not weakness, but precision. As though he had made the calculation long ago that each step taken poorly was a step wasted, and he had no more steps to waste. He was perhaps 65. He might have been 80. Reese had no way of knowing and had not asked. The arrangement had come through Marisol Guerrero, which was how most things in Reese's life that required navigation of difficult terrain, literal or otherwise, tended to come through. Marisol ran the small trading operation at the southern end of the valley, a low-slung building of pale adobe that served as store, post office, and in a practical sense, the administrative center of everything within a 40-mile radius that had no other administrative center. She was 52 years old and had been in that valley for 30 of those years and knew more about the relationships between the various people and groups who moved through it than anyone alive. She also knew things she didn't say aloud, which was the more useful portion of her knowledge. She had found Reese on a Thursday, which was his day for picking up whatever mail had accumulated at her counter, and she had said, without preamble, that there was a man at her place who needed to reach the northern settlement near the Red Bluffs, and that the direct route was not available to him, and that the way through the cut and across the dry lake and through the low hills to the north was the only road that would work, and that Reese was the only person she could think of who knew that road. And who could be asked? Why can't he go the direct route? Reese had said. Because the men who use the direct route don't know him and won't recognize the significance of who he is. She had paused. They would see an old Apache man traveling alone and make their own conclusions. Reese had looked at her for a moment. And the cut road? Long, hard, not a road for someone his age without help. She had set a cup of coffee on the counter in front of him without being asked. He needs to reach his daughter before the cold comes in. She's been waiting 3 years. That was the thing about Marisol. She always knew exactly which detail to deliver last. The journey was supposed to take 4 days. Reese had packed for 6, because he had learned over years of movement through that territory that 4-day plans had a way of expanding. He carried enough dried meat and meal for both of them, 2 good blankets, a canvas that could serve as shelter, water enough for the first leg before they reached the spring at the eastern edge of the dry lake, and a second horse, a steady grey animal named Cork, for Saguaro to ride when the walking became too much. They left before full light on a morning in late September, when the air had the first edge of what was coming in the seasons ahead. But the days still held warmth from noon through early evening. Saguaro had arrived at Reese's fence line at the appointed hour, which impressed Reese more than it probably should have, given that he had no particular reason to expect otherwise. The old man had a rolled blanket and a leather satchel that he carried across his body, and he looked at Cork with the evaluating eye of someone who had spent a great deal of time with horses and had formed specific opinions. "He's quiet," Reese said by way of introduction. Saguaro looked at the horse for another moment. Then he looked at Reese with the same expression, and Reese understood that this was not an insult and chose not to take it as one. They traveled the first morning in near silence, which suited Reese well enough. He was not a man who felt the need to fill space with sound. The land south of the cut was open scrubland, pale and spare, with low brush that cast almost no shadow, and the occasional yucca standing at the height of a man with its arms raised in what Reese had always privately thought looked more like surrender than defiance. The trail they followed was not a road. It was the kind of path made by enough repeated passages that the ground remembered without anyone having to mark it. A faint compression of the earth, a slight parting of the brush, the kind of thing you could follow easily once you knew how to read it and couldn't see at all if you didn't. Saguaro rode Cork without incident. He sat on the horse the way that certain experienced riders do, not rigidly, not with the performed ease of someone demonstrating comfort, but with a deep, settled quality, as if the animal had simply become an extension of where he was standing. Reese noted this without comment. By mid-morning, the cut was visible ahead as a vertical seam in the rock face, a darkness in the pale stone that announced nothing of its interior and gave no indication of its depth. Reese had always thought it looked from a distance like something that had been pried apart rather than carved, as if someone had found a crack in the world and widened it just enough to be useful. "We'll stop at the entry to water the animals," Reese said. "There's a seep just inside the first turning." Saguaro said nothing, which Reese had already begun to understand was not rudeness but economy. The old man said things when he had something to say. He did not appear to feel the obligation that most people felt to respond to every statement with a statement of equal length. Inside the cut, the cold settled on them both like a hand on the shoulder. Cork shook his head once, and then accepted it. The grey light that filtered down through the slot overhead turned everything the same flat shade, and sound moved differently, flatter, without echo, as though the stone absorbed it. Reese found the seep where it always was, a dark stain on the eastern wall at knee height that trickled into a shallow natural basin in the rock at the base. Both horses drank. Reese refilled one of the canvas water bags and ate a small amount of dried meat standing against the wall, while Saguaro rested on a flat stone near the water. It was during that rest that the old man spoke for the first time in several hours. "You have been through here before," he said. It was not a question. "Several times," Reese said. Saguaro looked up at the slot of sky overhead. A swift crossed it, a dark comma shape against the grey. "It looks different depending on the season," the old man said. "In the spring, when the water is running, the sound is different. The walls speak to each other." Reese looked at him. "You've been through here?" "Long ago." Saguaro lowered his gaze from the sky. "When I was young enough to run through it." Something in the way he said it, the plainness of it, the complete absence of sentiment, made Reese feel the distance between where they were and where the old man had begun in a new way. Not as a journey of miles, but as a journey of years. Of the particular weight that accumulates in a life that has moved through a landscape as it changes around you, not always in ways you chose. They reached the northern exit of the cut by early afternoon, and the change was immediate. The cold releasing, the sky opening, the flat expanse of the dry lake spreading before them in a white that was almost painful against the muted tones of everything they had passed through. The lake was perhaps 3 miles across and had not held water in living memory, though the ground still remembered it. The surface was cracked in interlocking plates, each edge curled slightly upward, the way dried mud curls, and beneath the thin white crust, the earth was a dull grey that suggested depth it no longer had. In the far distance, the low hills that marked the northern edge of the territory were visible as a dark line against the sky. And above them, the first reaches of the red bluffs caught afternoon light in a color that was genuinely startling. A deep orange-red that had no equivalent in the rest of the landscape. If you've been following this journey so far, a like on the video helps carry these stories to more people who'd want to hear them. 3 miles across, Reese said, more to himself than to Saguaro. 2 miles and 200 steps, Saguaro said. Reese looked at him. "I have crossed it twice," the old man said. "The second time I counted." They crossed in the late afternoon, and the light changed as they moved, the red bluffs ahead shifting through shades of amber and copper as the sun descended behind them. The sound on the dry lake was strange. Their footfalls muffled by the crust, the horses' hooves breaking through in places with a sound like cracking ice that released a faint white dust. Reese kept them moving at a steady pace without rushing. He watched Saguaro for signs of difficulty, but the old man rode Cork with the same settled patience he had shown all day, his eyes moving across the landscape with a quality of attention that Reese recognized. The way a person looks at a place they have a relationship with, not just a location they are passing through. They camped at the western edge of the dry lake, where a line of low rock jutted from the earth and provided a natural windbreak. Reese set up the canvas between 2 rock outcroppings and built a small fire in the depression behind the largest stone. The sky over the dry lake held color long after the sun went down, a deep red at the horizon, then a green that had no business being that vivid, then the blue that came before the dark. Saguaro sat near the fire and watched the sky go through its colors with the complete attention of someone who has learned not to take that particular event for granted. They ate in silence that was, by now, comfortable rather than cautious. Reese had traveled with enough different kinds of people to know the difference between a silence that came from wariness and a silence that came from something more like mutual respect for the fact that some things don't need to be said. "How long since you've seen your daughter?" Reese asked eventually. Saguaro thought about this in the unhurried way he thought about most things. 3 years as you count them, he said. 4 by my reckoning. Why the difference? Because I count from the last time I understood where she was, the old man said. There was a year in the middle when I knew she was alive, but I did not know her life. That year is not the same as the others. Reese turned this over in his mind. He didn't argue with the logic of it. Is she well? He asked. She is alive and she has children, Saguaro said. That is well enough for an old man to hope for. He looked at the fire. She married a man from the northern group, a good man from what I was told. I have not met him. You'll meet him in 2 days. 3, Saguaro said. Your 4 days will be 5. Reese looked at him. I know my pace, the old man said simply. I know it better than I used to. Reese said nothing for a moment. Then, 5 days is fine. The second morning broke cold enough that the rocks around the camp had a glaze of frost on their upper surfaces, and the dry lake behind them caught the first light in a way that made it look briefly, from a distance, like water. A flat silver that fooled the eye for just a moment before the sun climbed high enough to flatten it back into white. Reese broke camp while the fire still had some warmth in it and found Saguaro already up and standing east of the campsite, facing the morning with his eyes open and his expression entirely still in a way that might have read, to someone who didn't know better, as vacancy. Reese had learned in his years in that territory to recognize prayer when it appeared without ceremony. He busied himself with the horses and didn't hurry. The hills to the north were closer now, a day's ride to their edge, and then the low pass through them and the descent to the valley where the northern settlement sat. Reese had been there twice. It was not a large settlement, perhaps 40 people in a loose arrangement of structures that had no particular center, not a town exactly, not a camp, something in between. The people there had been in the territory long enough to have modified their expectations of what a permanent home required, and the result was a kind of practical ingenuity in everything they built that Reese had found admirable. They made good distance through the morning, moving across open country where the ground was firmer than the scrubland to the south and the brush lower and less dense. The red bluffs that had been on the horizon the day before were now close enough to show their real texture. Layered stone in shades that ran from pale orange at the top through deep red to a brown so dark it was nearly black at the base. At certain angles, the layering looked like the pages of an enormous book left standing in the weather, its pages slowly separating, but not yet falling. Saguaro noticed Reese looking at them. My grandfather said those were painted by the first people who came here, the old man said. Not painted with color, painted with meaning. He said that if you know how to read stone, those walls say something. What do they say? Reese asked. Saguaro was quiet for a moment. He never told me. He said you had to learn to read stone before you could be told, or the words would mean nothing. Did you learn? Some. The old man looked at the bluffs for a moment longer. Enough to understand that I don't understand most of it. That afternoon brought a complication Reese had not anticipated. Not a danger, nothing so sharp as that. A delay which in certain circumstances could become a danger if it extended long enough, but which for the moment was simply an obstacle. The trail through the low hills, which Reese had used twice before, and which he had every reason to expect to be passable, had been partially blocked by a rockslide sometime in the weeks or months before their arrival. Not a massive collapse. The hill was still entirely intact, and nothing about the landscape suggested ongoing instability. But a section of perhaps 30 yards, where a shelf of sandstone had let go of the slope above and come down across the path in a tumbled arrangement of pieces ranging from fist-sized to the size of a small building. Reese sat his horse at the edge of it and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Cork beside him showed no distress. Saguaro looked at the rockfall with the same evaluating expression he had applied to the horse 2 days prior. There's a way around, Reese said eventually. South of the main hill, it adds time. How much time? Reese thought honestly. Half a day, maybe more. Saguaro considered this. South of the hill, there is a dry watercourse, wide enough for the horses. Reese looked at him. You've been through here. I have been through most of this territory, Saguaro said, without pride, simply as a fact. The watercourse is easier than it looks from above. You would not have seen it from this angle. They took the dry watercourse, which was indeed wide enough for the horses, and offered better footing than the loose ground on the hillside that would have been the other alternative. It added not half a day, but perhaps 3 hours, and by the time they emerged from between the hills onto the far slope, the light was going amber, and the valley below was visible, a broad depression in the landscape, greener than anything they had passed through, with the glint of actual running water in the distance and the dark shapes of structures arranged without particular symmetry along its southern bank. Rhys had expected, at this point, to feel the journey settling toward its conclusion. They were close enough to see the destination. The hard country was behind them. The old man was tired, but no worse than tired. He had handled the journey without complaint and without faltering, which spoke to a reserves of physical endurance that Rhys found genuinely impressive. By any reasonable accounting, the difficult part was over. He was wrong about this. They descended the slope into the valley as the light continued to drop, and when they were perhaps a mile from the settlement, close enough to see movement near the structures, figures, horses, the slow activity of a late afternoon camp, Saguaro stopped Cork at the top of a small rise and sat very still. Rhys stopped beside him. "What is it?" The old man was looking at the settlement below with an expression Rhys had not seen on him before. It was not alarm. It was not the alert watchfulness that Saguaro had applied to things that required careful assessment. It was something quieter and harder to name, the look of someone who has prepared for something and, at the moment of arrival, finds that no preparation was quite sufficient. "She is down there," Saguaro said. "Your daughter?" "Yes." They sat for a moment in the cooling air at the top of the rise. The valley spread below them, the last horizontal light catching the tops of the structures and the glinting water. "Are you ready?" Rhys asked. The old man thought about this with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. "I have been walking toward this for 4 years, he said finally. "Whether I am ready or not is a question I stopped asking a long time ago." They rode down the slope. The settlement had seen them coming. Eyes in open country always see movement before sound. And by the time Rhys and Saguaro reached the southern edge of the structures, several people had gathered at the approach. Rhys scanned the group with the practiced habit of a man accustomed to reading the temperature of an arrival. What he saw was not tension. It was something more like the quality of air before a storm, charged, attentive, expectant. And then, from among the gathered figures, a woman walked forward. She was perhaps 40 years old, and she moved toward them across the open ground, between the settlement's edge and where the horses stood in the way that Rhys had always thought distinguished people who were accustomed to the landscape from people who were merely passing through it. She walked as though the ground were familiar, not careless, but at home. She stopped 10 feet from Cork and looked up at the man on the horse. What happened next was not what Rhys would have predicted, had he been asked to predict it beforehand. The woman said nothing. She did not speak. She raised one hand, palm upward, toward the old man on the horse, a gesture so specific in its shape that it clearly carried meaning that Rhys was not equipped to translate. And Saguaro, on Cork's back, sat perfectly still for a moment, and then he lowered himself from the saddle, carefully, slowly, with the methodical precision of someone who has learned to manage the gap between intention and capacity. And he stood on the ground and looked at his daughter, and she looked at him. The silence between them lasted the length of a breath. Then she stepped forward and put her hands on his arms, just above the elbows, and he put his hands on her arms in the same place. And they stood that way while the last light of the day slid off the red bluffs above the valley, and the sky overhead turned the color of deep water. Rhys sat his horse at the edge of this and looked away without being asked to. He found somewhere to look, the line of hills they had come through still visible against the sky. And he gave the moment the space it required. He stayed at the settlement that night at the insistence of a man named Duarte, who appeared to be some kind of coordinator of its logistics, and who communicated with Reese in a direct, efficient manner that Reese appreciated. He was fed and given a place near the fire and introduced briefly to the people who passed through the central space of the camp. Saguaro's daughter, her name was Huera, which someone explained to Reese meant something close to clear water in translation, came to him before the evening was far advanced, and thanked him in words that were formal in their precision and genuine in a way that went beyond formality. He could not have made this crossing alone, she said. He made most of it himself, Reese said, which was close enough to the truth to feel honest. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. He told me what you said to him on the first morning. Reese tried to remember what he had said on the first morning. The horse is quiet. That was all he could recall. He said you looked at him the same way you looked at everything else, Huera said, as if he was simply part of the landscape that needed to be understood. Reese didn't know what to say to that. He said nothing, which seemed to be the appropriate response. In this territory, she said, that is not as common as it should be. She left him to his thoughts, and he sat with them for a while beside the fire while the settlement settled into its evening routines around him. The red bluffs to the east had gone entirely dark, but he knew they were there, their weight and scale present in the landscape even without visibility, the way certain things are more present in the dark than in the light, because the dark strips away everything that is not essential. He thought about the old man counting 2,000 steps across the dry lake, because he had crossed it before and wanted to know its measure exactly. He thought about Marisol setting the coffee down without being asked. He thought about the way Saguaro had navigated the rockfall by knowing a watercourse that Reese hadn't known to look for, by having, in his memory and his body, a map of this territory that went back further and ran deeper than any map Reese carried. He thought about arriving somewhere after 4 years and finding that the preparation was insufficient. In the morning, he rode back the way he had come. South through the low hills, across the dry lake in the early light when the crust was still cold and the frost still held in the shadows, through the cut with the swifts threading the air above the slot, and out again into the open scrubland south of the canyon. He reached his own fence line on the 5th day, as Saguaro had predicted. Cork walked through the gate and into the familiar yard with the settled relief of an animal returning to known ground. And Reese unsaddled him and turned him out into the pasture and stood at the fence for a while watching the horse move out across the grass. It was a Thursday. He had mail to collect from Marisol. When he stopped there that afternoon, she looked at him across the counter with the expression she used when she already knew how something had gone. "Well," she said. "We made it," Reese said. She nodded once. She set a coffee on the counter without being asked. He drank it standing there in the low-ceilinged room with its smell of dried goods and old paper, and outside the light was doing what it always did at that hour in that season, turning everything to gold and shadow in equal measure, and the territory stretched away from them in all directions, enormous and indifferent and full, as it always had been, of things that had no name on any map, but that were there regardless. Months later, a small wrapped package arrived for Reese at Marisol's counter. Inside was a piece of worked leather, a band of some kind, decorated with a careful pattern in dyed thread. There was no note. There didn't need to be. He kept it on the shelf above the fireplace for years. Subscribed to follow stories like this one every week. Every journey ends somewhere unexpected.